I'm Anna Rose, the Exhibitions and Programming Associate at the Wende. Thanks so much for joining us today for our Cold War Spaces series. Today's topic is Celluloid Space, Hollywood's Cold War, and we're very happy to welcome Tony Shaw as our guest. He's Professor of History at the University of Hertfordshire in England, and he's an internationally recognized expert specializing in film and propaganda. He's written extensively on 20th century international propaganda and cinema, and has worked on the modern history of the Middle East, on the culture of the Cold War, and on terrorism and the mass media. He's the author of 5 books, including, among others, British Cinema in the Cold War, The State, Propaganda, and Consensus, Hollywood's Cold War, and Cinematic Cold War, the American and Soviet struggle for hearts and minds. Today's program will be about a 30-minute conversation with Joes Segal, the Wende's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. And after that, we'll leave about 15 minutes for Q&A, so please get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box during that time. And as always, please keep your questions short and concise, no longer than a sentence or two, so that we can try to get to everyone's. And for anything, other comments or anything else, please use the chat box. I see that some people have already gotten started. It's always nice to see where people are tuning in from. And a quick reminder to please switch the blue box next to the chat box to panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your messages. We'll be posting the recording of today's program on our Vimeo page, where you can find the recordings of all of our other virtual programming. And lastly, I'd like to thank Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and all of our virtual programs. And I'll hand it off to you to get started.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna Rose. We know that the Cold War was a period of ideological, technological, and cultural competition. And all of these 3 elements are reflected in Cold War film history. In conversation with Anatoly Lunacharsky, who was the People's Commissar of Education in the early Soviet Union, Lenin once remarked that of all the arts, cinema is the most important to us, and us meaning the Bolshevik political leadership. And indeed, the propaganda value of movies, with their seductive presentation of alternative realities, has been a favorite tool of influencing and indoctrination among a wide variety of regimes in the 20th century. However, films do not always reflect existing power relations. They can also criticize and subvert those very power relations. And I'm very happy to discuss the ideological aspects of Cold War film history with Tony Shaw, as mentioned, a great expert of propaganda and film history during the 20th century. So Tony, welcome to Cold War Spaces.
Hi, Joes, great to be here, thank you.
Sure, and let's start with this Lenin quote about the importance of film and cinema. Why do you think film is such a powerful propaganda tool?
I think there were particular reasons why Lenin himself saw so much in film. I mean, if you think back to 1917 or the 1920s, then for film was great to overcome the illiteracy of Russians. Film was great to overcome the different languages that Russians had, because this is a silent era. You could easily use intertitles. Film was great also as a sign of progress in and of itself. Just the amazement of seeing moving pictures for many peasant Russians, for instance, was a great way of selling the revolutionary nature of Bolshevik society. But leaving that aside, moving away from Lenin and the Soviet Union, there are more general reasons, of course, why film has been so used and exploited perhaps by politicians. I mean, obviously still, even in the 21st century, most people associate cinema, film with entertainment. They don't think of it as a political medium. Right. And even people who are media savvy don't think of it as a political medium. So one can obviously hide one's political inflections and motives behind that. And obviously, just to think about the range of genre that one gets with cinema, whether it's documentaries, whether it's romantic comedies or adventures, there are just so many different ways that one can transmit information and persuasion, which is seductive, I think, for politicians. And I think the final reason is you need lots of money to make films, generally speaking. And you need lots of money, then it's largely institutions, governments, organizations that can make big, powerful movies.
Sure, yeah. Okay, so speaking about the United States and the Soviet Union, during the interwar years before the Second World War, American movies painted a pretty bleak picture of the Soviet Union, generally speaking. That changed for a short period of time during the Second World War, when both countries were allies. But then again, starting with the early Cold War years, 1947-48, the communism bashing, if you will, started again. I'm thinking of the period with McCarthy, the communist witch hunts, and also the House Un-American Activities Committee with their anti-communist hearings. Can you tell a little bit about the atmosphere in the American film world during those years?
Yeah, so we're talking about, let's say, a long period of, let's say, from the 1920s through to the 50s, you know, a 30-year period, and Hollywood gets in on the act very, very quickly. The Cold War, in cinematic terms, starts immediately as the Bolshevik Revolution happens, and in the first Red Scare after 1917, soon after the First World War, we see a number of crude anti-communist films which Hollywood is producing. Which now, of course, look really quite laughable if people bother to look at them. But I think, and I'm going to share the screen with you now, Joseph, just to bring up some images here.
Right.
Can you see this, Jos?
Yes, perfect. Yeah.
Great. So I think, I'm not altogether sure whether people will have heard of this film, but this film called Ninotchka came out in 1939. And to my mind, this is the sort of really interesting, should we say, pre-Cold War film that Hollywood was turning out. In other words, before the Cold War starts, as many people sort of think of it. And this is a subtle way of red bashing, if we want to call it. Ninotchka was a story of a Soviet commissar played by the great screen goddess, as she was called, Greta Garbo of the 1930s. Garbo plays this Soviet commissar who goes to Paris for political work, ends up falling in love with Western consumerism, falling in love with an American guy played by Melvyn Douglas there. You see him on the right. And there she is on the right, slightly drunk, having drunk her first champagne and tasted the glamour of Western accoutrements and consumerism. And she falls in love with that. She falls in love with the American guy, and she ends up defecting. And I think that's a great example of indirect, we might call it, propaganda, which Hollywood was producing in the 1930s. Now, into the war, it's true, Hollywood produced a small number of pro-Russian films, not pro-communist, of course, but pro-Russian films. And these films became the target after the war for those people who wanted to interrogate Hollywood, the McCarthyites, the House Un-American Activities Committees, which landed in Hollywood in 1947 and revisited in the late 40s and early 50s, and really interrogated Hollywood for its liberal leftist stance. And what we saw, and as you can see from this slide here, is Hollywood has to defend itself. Hollywood has to and does churn out a quite large number of what we would call crude anti-communist pictures. The Iron Curtain on the left there was a very early espionage picture. This is what most people would call the first Hollywood Cold War film in the right sense. Iron Curtain on the left. More sensationalist pictures such as I Married a Communist came out a couple of years later, and I don't think I need to describe what sort of picture that was about. You can probably judge that from the poster. And My Son John, which came out in 1953, and to many people's minds, it's probably the most hard-hitting anti-communist film, and it tells the story of a sweet family guy who betrays his mother and father by being a communist, who's in Washington at the heart of the American government. And the film depicts, in many ways, communism as a sort of deviancy, and deviancy in a political and sexual terms. So this was very much of its age. And it's during this period, of course, that Hollywood is feeling the need to counterattack those people from the center and the right who are accusing it of being pro-communist.
Right. And some of these films were actually sponsored by the FBI, right? So can you tell us a little bit about how that worked and how strict the control over the content was exerted by the FBI? And I'm also very curious how successful the films actually were.
Yeah, let me move on, see if we come here. So yeah, the FBI, this is J. Edgar Hoover on the left, the head of the FBI, of course, from the 1920s through to the 1970s. Hoover was a strange guy, you know, a very secretive, private guy, but who loved publicity, and he knew that the FBI needed publicity. And at the same time, of course, he's feeding the House Un-American Activities Committee with dubious information about leftists in Hollywood. So on the one hand, he's attacking Hollywood behind the scenes. On the other hand, in the open, he begins to use Hollywood. He wants Hollywood to make films which can big up the FBI. Films, for instance, such as this on the right. This is Walk East on Beacon, which is a film that came out in the early 1950s. And of course, it's a sort of red baiting picture, but not in the crude fashion, in the way in which I've just been talking about. Walk East on Beacon is a drama documentary. It's very sober. It's fact-based. Essentially, it tells the story of a bunch of communist spies in Boston who are trying to dig up atomic and American space secrets. The FBI is very keen on giving assistance to the film behind the scenes. It helps with the script. It helps with the expertise. It helps with the logistical, practical, giving equipment, for instance. Some of its agents were there on hand as consultants. And this sort of film, whilst not being massive commercial successes, I think was successful in underpinning the sense of, you know, we need to take communism seriously. Lots of critics of this film, I mean critics, not people who've been critical of it, lots of reviewers thought this was a fascinating sort of picture. It gave the inside slant on what detection was really like for the security services. And this film, in fact, went on being distributed way into the 1970s. It was so successful for the FBI as a sort of publicity or marketing tool.
Right. So another question I have is, since in Soviet, anti-American Soviet propaganda, American racism always plays a very important role. Can you say something about the representation of African Americans in Hollywood films, and if there was a kind of response to these?
Let me briefly show you, Joes, if I can, a very short animated Soviet film from the 1930s, which targets American racism. It's not great quality, but hopefully it only lasts for 2 minutes, but hopefully it will, you'll get the gist of what the movie is about. So I'm going to play this all the way through for a couple of minutes. Can you see that, Joes? Yeah?
Yeah, we can see it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost
I've just switched back, Joes, to just move on to this. So this is a film that you saw just there, a Soviet film from the 1930s, targeting American racism. And this really was, for the American government, the Achilles heel, I think, in image terms for the United States during the Cold War. And what the American government had to do was counter this propaganda. And so in a sense, what we're here talking about is American counter propaganda and the extent to which Hollywood came into that game. And one a good example of this is how the Hollywood teamed up with the United States Information Agency. The United States Information Agency was the overt propaganda arm of the American government during the Cold War. And together, the USIA and on Hollywood produced in 1964 a short documentary called 9 from Little Rock, which you'll see there on the right. 9 from Little Rock retold the events of 1957 in Little Rock, Arkansas. You see there on the left a picture of essentially white vigilantes attacking black students going to the local school, Little Rock High. This was a dreadful time for America's international image in 1957. And what 9 from Little Rock, the film, does in 1964 is put a positive spin on that negative story very cleverly. Essentially, it interviews a bunch of students who'd graduated from Little Rock High. All of them, or all of those that have been interviewed, had been semi-successful in getting jobs or in moving into postgraduate work, et cetera, et cetera. The film was meant, of course, because it was made by the United States Information Agency, the film was very much meant for the overseas audiences. And this was key to the American government in the 1950s and 60s. Winning the Cold War battle for hearts and minds in the third world was critical by this stage, and tried to sell, for instance, to Asians the idea that America could be trusted, did have equal rights, was a true free society, was absolutely central in propaganda terms. And 9 from Little Rock was an example of that. The film won an Oscar, very unusual for a foreign aimed film to win an Oscar. The film actually didn't, final thing to say about it, didn't altogether work that well. When a bunch of Indian students saw it, they misread parts of the film and misread it as, you know, and they read it that actually there was still a lot of existing racism in Arkansas. And I think it's a good illustration that you might try your very best to produce a good piece of filmic propaganda, but sometimes film could be misread or misinterpreted. Right,
right. And also probably because they did actually showcase the societal conflicts that were still relevant at the time, only they added their solution. You have so many really wonderful case studies in your book, Hollywood's Cold War. I want to point to one of them, the film adaptations of Animal Farm in 1984, the George Orwell novels. Can you tell us a little bit how those films were made, and also where they differed from the original novels and what the ideological implication of those differences were?
Yeah. So George Orwell died in 1950. He dies very early in the Cold War, but by that point he's already an icon in many ways, and he becomes an icon of the Cold War. His two books, Animal Farm and 1984, are of course amongst the most influential books of the second half of the 20th century in political terms, and some of the most influential books of the Cold War. Both books were turned into movies in the mid 1950s in Britain. These are essentially Anglo-American collaborations. Animal Farm is turned into a great animated film, which you see there on the left, made by two British animators called Hallis and Batchelor. In other words, this is not Disney. This is a sort of more European style of animation. And we know now that the Central Intelligence Agency was behind the making of this animated version of Animal Farm. It supplied finance. It was absolutely central to this, to adapting, to scripting it, and in marketing and helping to distribute it. At the time, of course, no one knew this. This was secret CIA interest. And in fact, I remember just about 15 years ago when I interviewed a bunch of people who had worked for the animation company that made this movie. And when I disclosed to them that I found evidence that the CIA had been behind it, they were genuinely shocked and really quite angered that I was somehow or other accusing them of having been complicit. But the CIA makes sure that it changes the adaptation of Animal Farm into much more of an anti-Soviet polemic. So for instance, it makes Napoleon, who's the bullying pig, it makes Napoleon, who of course stands for Stalin, much more of a central figure. But more importantly is the ending. What you're looking at there on screen is the end scene of this movie. Now, the end of the book ends pessimistically, essentially with the pigs lording it over the beasts. But at the end of the film, the beasts revolt against Napoleon and his pig sidekicks. And this is what you're seeing. The pigs had just, their farmhouse is just being assaulted by the beasts. So it seems to me, in other words, it's clear that what the CIA wanted to do was to use Animal Farm as a sort of model for those who are living under communism to think about rebelling or thinking about dissent. Now, of course, the film was never shown in Eastern Europe. It was banned from there. The novels were banned from there. But it went on to become a really important teaching tool in parts of the West. I mean, when I was a school kid, a teenager in the 1970s and 1980s, I was taught Animal Farm using this film. It became a very important tool in educational terms.
Right.
The other film, 1984, there, just briefly about that. 1984, there is moved into, again, an Anglo-American film, mid-1950s. And once again, it's changed to make it much more of an anti-Soviet film. And once again, it's the ending which really underlines this. At the end of the book, 1984, Winston Smith has been tortured, and he, as Orwell puts it, he learns to love Big Brother. At the end of the film, he revolts. He shouts down with Big Brother, and he and his girlfriend Julia are machine gunned. But in other words, it's a story about, it's turned into a story about revolt.
Right. Very interesting. And by the way, the animation version of Animal Farm is our film of the week on Friday. So please watch it if you can. I want to ask you also, because these films support more or less the standard Cold War rhetoric in the United States, but of course there were also films that were much more critical or even tried to subvert that very rhetoric. Thinking of Dr. Strangelove in 1964 or Woody Allen's Bananas. Can you tell us a bit about those more critical approaches to American Cold War rhetoric?
Yeah. So let's talk about Dr. Strangelove first. And I suppose before we move on to Dr. Strangelove, which came out in the mid-1960s, we should look at how Hollywood treated the question of nuclear weapons in the 1950s very quickly. And what we have here are two pictures which played with the nuclear question. Strategic Air Command there, it was a very pro-government, very pro-nuclear film starring Jimmy Stewart as an Air Force pilot, essentially protecting the globe from a Soviet threat. And this is an example of the Pentagon also lending assistance to Hollywood in the 1950s. On the right, we have an example of ways in which Hollywood could be more fantastical with playing around with nuclear energy and it leading to mutation. For instance, creating 50-foot women. This sci-fi cycle of the 50s was very much related to the nuclear danger. When we come to Dr. Strangelove, of course, this is a very different take. Dr. Strangelove wasn't the first Hollywood film to be critical of nuclear weapons. On the Beach, which is a great movie which came out in 1959, which is a mordant film about death and inevitable death brought by nuclear war. But Dr. Strangelove, without doubt, had the edge on that, and anything that came before it, and arguably anything that came after it. Kubrick's film was immediately seen as a masterpiece, one of the most thoughtful films or any medium questioning the sanity of nuclear weapons. Kubrick made the film in Britain. He could have made it in Hollywood. He wouldn't have had the sword of the Pentagon, but I think he felt freer, the fact that he'd been moved to Britain by this point. And he was somewhat freer. I think the restrictions around making nuclear films in Britain were less than they were generally in Hollywood, still in the mid-1960s. So this clearly is a seminal film. As we move through into the 1970s, we have to realize that the 1970s is a much more critical phase during the Cold War. And in a way, Hollywood is riding that wave. Hollywood rarely, during the Cold War, and ever for that matter, rarely puts its head above the parapet in political terms. It generally tends to reflect or follow political opinion. And by the 70s, of course, we have the Vietnam conflict. By the 70s, there are structural changes that have taken place in Hollywood, more independent filmmaking, etc. And the scope for criticism politically is much greater. And examples of this on the left there is a documentary made in 1973 called Hearts and Minds, which is an extraordinarily critical film of the United States in Vietnam, and essentially accuses the United States of being imperialistic. And in itself became a classic. On the right is the sort of a cycle of anti-CIA films that came out in the mid to late 1970s. This is 3 Days of the Condor, starring Robert Redford, who discovers the CIA are up to all tricks in the United States, following Watergate and other revelations. And then Woody Allen's Bananas, I think is less well known than the other two on the slide there, but Bananas came out in the early 70s and was a sort of plague on both your houses, critical of the political right in the United States, but also critical of those who made heroes out of Latin American guerrillas. And Woody Allen stars in his own film, and he's basically this nerdish product tester in New York who ends up going to South America and ends up becoming a leader of a South American state. It's typical Woody Allen madcap stuff. It didn't do very well at the box office. Many people, I think, just didn't get it, and it was partly before Woody Allen became a real household name.
Right. Okay, thank you. So there is much more to ask, but it's 12:30, so let's go to the Q&A first. And maybe if you can stop screen sharing, we can see you again. Yeah, perfect. So there are already a few questions. The first one, and not for the first time, is by Bruce Hollihan. And he asks, to what extent does current day American fear of anything associated with the term socialism have to do with Hollywood cinema, past and present? I find it baffling that some fellow Americans fail to see a difference between Denmark and the Soviet Union, historically and politically speaking.
Well, how much Hollywood has to do that with that, that's very difficult. But I certainly would say that Hollywood has for generations simplified the differences between political left and right, and the differences between liberalism and socialism. Of course, Hollywood has to use broad brushstrokes. That's what mass entertainment works on and thrives on. So perhaps Hollywood has played a part. It's certainly played a part, like I say, in simplifying matters. And I think some element of the movies that I've been talking about have had a long-lasting effect.
Right, right. Vladimir Paperny writes, Lubitsch specifically said to Salka Viertel that he did not want to create an anti-Soviet film, Ninochka. And there is a second question from Vladimir Paperny. Is it safe to say that censorship in the US went from the bottom up? For instance, the Legion of Decency, etc., and in the USSR from top down?
Yeah, good questions. Yeah, the question about Ninochka and Lubitsch, the director. Yeah, I mean, there is a debate actually about how anti-Soviet or anti-communist Ninochka is. I think it's generally more pro-Western than anti-Soviet. And its jibes, its jabs at the Soviet Union are mild by comparison with what came, let's say, 10 or 20 years later. But it seems to me that it's critical of the Soviet Union nonetheless, even in a soft way rather than a hard-hitting way. The point about censorship, I think there's a lot there. Yeah, in other words, I think what I've tried in a way to demonstrate is that censorship of Hollywood might have come down from the top through different organizations or agencies related to government, but it could also come, from with a number of organizations had, should we say, censored Hollywood for quite a long time before the Cold War, whether it was a Legion of Decency or Catholic organizations. And these, you're right, bottom-up organizations, or the American Legion, for instance, had perhaps arguably a greater role in the early years, certainly, of Hollywood than they did when the Cold War came along. I think the American government was more involved, but in a hidden way. Whereas I think you're right, when it comes to Soviet films, censorship is much more overt. It's more top-down, without doubt, yeah.
Right. Beata Hock asks, have you looked at how post-Cold War US films were reflecting on the period and its cultural Cold War? Maybe you can combine in your answer also a little bit about the 1980s with the return of a more conservative outlook in the Reagan era and then beyond. Yeah.
Well, briefly in the 1980s, well, we definitely see a much more radical shift to the right in Hollywood's Cold War take. Movies like Rambo, movies like Red Dawn, these hyper-violent movies of that, in other words, America is under threat, it might even be invaded, or John Rambo, Sylvester Stallone going back to Vietnam to refight and win that war. Those became extraordinarily popular in that period. I've been doing actually quite a bit of, I've been looking into how the Cold War is considered now by Hollywood, and it really deals with the Cold War in different ways, as one might expect. But I think if you take a look at Steven Spielberg's Bridge of Spies, which came out 5 years ago, a real blockbuster made by Mr. Liberal himself, the most powerful filmmaker in the world. And this is a film about a spy swap. It's fronted by, in the 1960s, it's fronted by Tom Hanks, who plays a lawyer, essentially seeking to facilitate the spy swap. And I think that is a classic way in which Hollywood now deals with the Cold War. If one reads it, it looks to be neutral politically, but in many ways it's not. It's a sort of celebration of American values. So Hollywood still plays, even the internet age, still has something to say about the Cold War.
Interesting. Yeah. I have a question here from M.A. Powell. Do you think there was hidden communist activity taking place in Hollywood?
Okay. Very, very, very little. Very little. Put it this way, if it was hidden, I've not found it, and I don't know anyone who really has found it. There was, of course, it depends what you mean by communist. There were leftist filmmakers, actors, etc., who were quite influential in Hollywood in the 1930s and during the Second World War. Those were the people who were sort of blacklisted in the 1950s during the McCarthy era, and they were target of HUAC. If Hollywood has been political in many ways, it's strange that Hollywood has this sort of liberal reputation with, you know, a number of stars like Jane Fonda and Warren Beatty, etc. One can point to liberal stars like that, but actually the people with the money in Hollywood, the directors, the producers, the studio guys, they've been highly conservative, and one could argue that there's not so much a threat from communism. There's not a, if the threat ever was there, it was very mild indeed, and Hollywood has been really quite conservative for a long time.
Right, thank you. Next question is by Nathaniel Hansen. Are there late Cold War movies beside the Bond movie, The Living Daylights, or maybe Red Heat, in which the West and the Soviet Union are cooperating to fight new foes, criminals, etc.?
Well, you point to Red Heat, which was a Arnold Schwarzenegger film, which is a good example of that from the late 80s. So that's he basically plays a Russian policeman who comes over to the United States to fight crime. In other words, these two, East and West, is joining against the threat of crime. I think maybe drug crime in the United States. There were a few in the very, very late 80s. Ruskies is a film which talks about peaceful coexistence. And even actually, if you look at, people point to Rocky IV, the film which depicts Rocky the boxer fighting a Russian android. And of course, he defeats him. This came out in 1985. The very end of that film has Sylvester Stallone's Rocky talking about the need for, peaceful coexistence. So I think there are already hints. This is very early on in the Gorbachev era. There are already hints in that sort of film, surprisingly, of a sense of there could be a coming together.
Right. Thanks. William Kuhl asks if you know the film Planet of the Apes, and what is your take on that film in the context of the Cold War?
Well, I think most people think of Planet of the Apes in terms of its end scene, where Charlton Heston, the American astronaut, is walking along the beach. He thinks he's landed on a foreign planet, and what he comes across is a decapitated Statue of Liberty. And he realizes that he's in the United States, and the United States has been destroyed, centuries before or generations before, has been destroyed by a nuclear war, and the apes have taken over. And Heston screams with anger and sadness that the world has been destroyed by nuclear war. And that my take, therefore, is that it's a critique of nuclear weapons. And this came out in the late 1960s, so it very much fits with the sort of post Dr. Strangelove era.
Right. I have another question for you. So we know from the history books that both Hitler and Stalin were very avid film consumers. But in your book, you also mention Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger being inspired by John Wayne and other movie stars actually in their international policy. Can you tell a little bit about your take on the influence of Hollywood movies on American politicians?
It's a difficult one. This we'd love, as film historians like myself would love to find lots of evidence of politicians thinking they're movie stars and mimicking their favorite actors. I mean, Nixon did watch an extraordinary number, something like 500 movies when he was in the White House, either in the White House or in Camp David. He was an avid movie fan. He was very close and had been very close to John Wayne since Wayne had started to support him as an anti-communist in the 1950s. John Wayne was extraordinarily influential on the political stage before Ronald Reagan came along. Very influential. Wayne didn't become a politician like Reagan, but very influential, making films like The Green Berets, the only sort of pro-Vietnam film that came out during the Vietnam War. Kissinger talked of he sort of was inspired by that John Wayne type character of the sheriff, the cowboy who comes into town alone, and he said he was inspired in his diplomatic affairs in using the same style when it came to trying to strike deals or stand up to the Soviets and others. So there are, they certainly riff off one another, and of course Reagan is that great example of someone who genuinely believed in many ways. I'm not being sarcastic here, that he could often mistake his old roles for reality when he was in the White House. So this is important.
Sure. Beata Hoek asks if you can comment on the film Trumbo from 2015, if you are familiar with it. She also remarks that it's maybe more well known in Europe than in the United States.
Yeah, I do know the film. And it's interesting. It's part of a small number of films that Hollywood have made, reflecting on the McCarthy era and reflecting on the number of Hollywood scriptwriters and stars who were blacklisted. I think it's a piece of good entertainment. Perhaps it's rather kind to Dalton Trumbo in terms of politically and character-wise. But I think, like I say, it seems to me, in terms of Hollywood looking back at the Cold War, Hollywood does like to go back to that McCarthy era and does like to actually talk about the impact that McCarthyism had on Hollywood itself. In other words, I think it's Hollywood looking back at itself, which is interesting.
Right. So it's about time, but I do want to ask you one final question, because we have been talking about film as a reflection of society, and we are living in such crazy times now, so such deep divides socially, politically. Do you see a reflection of the Trump era in Hollywood films or films in general?
That's a tough one. I sort of, as an historian, I tend to rely on mining archives and trying to find real evidence as to why films get made and who's behind them, etc. I mean, clearly we're not seeing a great divide in the way in which perhaps we did during some stages of the Cold War. Perhaps if Trump leaves office, I think we could see Hollywood then becoming quite a bit more active in looking back at the Trump presidency, and that will be very interesting to look forward to.
Great. Tony, I want to thank you very, very much for this very lively and entertaining presentation. It was great to have you in this series.
Okay.
And
thanks, Joes.
Sure. So next week, I will have a Cold War Spaces interview with Mark Valley, who, apart from a very successful actor, is also the host and producer of the podcast The Live Drop, about real Cold War spy stories. I will speak with him about underground space Cold War spy adventures, and hope to see you then. Have a wonderful week.